So this will be the first in a series of talks about finding the historical Jesus. I know what you're thinking, not another thing about the historical Jesus. You know, there's plenty of them out there. There's hundreds, probably thousands of books written about the historical Jesus. Certainly hundreds and thousands of articles have been written about him. I'm going to bring a different approach to it. I'm not so locked into traditional interpretations of much of the early data that other historians have been locked into, it seems. And so I take a different approach and see things in a slightly different way, which is borne out by the data itself. As we go along, you'll see that what I have uncovered clarifies a lot of things and makes it more simple to understand that historical Jesus and to have a new interpretation of who he was. Some of the things that we'll be going over will be the fact that, you know, he was born into a wealthy family, that he was, and his father was, they were both temple priests. You'll understand better about the virgin birth and why that story was necessary, and that is corroborated by Jewish writings. You'll understand the crucifixion much better too, and the fact that he survived the crucifixion and went on to live a pretty full life, and actually didn't die until in his 70s. And that is also borne out by historical writing. Anyway, got a lot of ground to cover, you know, so I'm going to break this up into a smaller series of lectures. I don't want to go on too long in each one, probably 20, maybe 30 minutes and for each one. And I'll probably skip around a lot because, as my wife would be happy to tell you, I'm extremely disorganized and I kind of wing it on a lot of things. But the main thing is, you know, you'll be able to verify these things by doing internet searches and having a few books that I'll recommend available to you. Some of the books that you should have are at least 3 or 4 different editions of the New Testament. Having a copy of the first century historian Josephus is always a good idea when you're going down this road. A lot of the other things you can access online. Find a good Greek lexicon so that you can look up words and find their true definitions and their root words as well, which is really important. And then other minor things that you'll be able to look up as we go along. One of the first things that we need to do, and that most other scholars don't seem to do, is determine what the Gospels are, especially the synoptics, the first 3. It's really important if you're going to research this and study this in any kind of depth. You need to know what the material is that you're studying. When you look at Josephus, you know he's a historian, and that's what you have in front of you is a history. In other works, you know for sure that, you know, they're allegory or they're for entertainment purposes or whatever it may be. So determining what the Gospels are is extremely important before you move forward with it, which we will do. And we will determine, you know, who wrote them, or at least the first couple of them. With that in mind, we have to determine also the correct order for the synoptics. Generally, scholars today say that Mark was written first, and then came Matthew, Luke, and then obviously John, rounding out the New Testament. But there are internal evidences that that's not the case. what I call synoptic progressions that exist in the synoptics that would indicate that no, the order should be Mark first, Luke second, Matthew third. And those progressions, if I can find my notes, and this first one is probably the most important. Each of the three synoptics recounts the baptism story. In the first, in Mark, what is recounted is that a spirit came down from the sky to basically bless or ordain Jesus during his baptism. The second one, Luke, that spirit becomes the Holy Spirit. And in the third, what I say is the third, Matthew, that Holy Spirit becomes God. Now, you have to understand the Jewish culture enough to understand that there is no way that if Matthew came before Luke, Luke would have dropped a reference to God. In other words, you can't have Luke saying the spirit that came down during the baptism was God. You have to understand that there's a progression there, and that would have been the last thing. Luke would not have come along after Matthew and not used God as the Spirit. Luke refers to the Holy Spirit. That indicates that that writing came before Matthew. The Jews of the time were so serious about protecting the name of God or the use of God that they had basically what they called genizas, or discard libraries. In other words, they would never destroy any work that had God in it. They would put it aside in these special libraries, basically, and let them rot out on their own. They would not do anything. The Jews would not do anything to destroy that because it had the word God in it. That's how seriously they took it. So the idea that, Matthew indicating God came before Luke, who doesn't indicate God, doesn't make sense. The second thing is that in Mark and Luke, after the crucifixion, after Jesus is married, on the Sunday that the women came to the tomb, in Mark and Luke, the tomb was found open. Matthew comes along and cleans that up and says, no, the stone was still in front of the opening of the tomb, and that the women had to find somebody to help them roll the tomb away. That's just a question, and we'll get into this more as we understand what was going on with Jesus and his survival of the crucifixion and what have you. If you're going to have that story in there where somebody comes along and finds the tomb, and the tomb is open, there's an argument that can be made that Jesus didn't rise from the dead, that somebody came into the tomb, took the body out, and left the tomb open after they left. So in Mark and Luke, those two gospels show that the tomb was open, and Matthew, understanding the difference, recognizes that no, in order to really show that Jesus rose from the dead, the tomb has to be found closed. You take out the chance that, hey, the open tomb means that the body was taken out. So Matthew corrects that. The other thing is, another progression is that in Mark and Luke, in the parable of Jairus' daughter, both Mark and Luke use the name Jairus. Matthew does not. And there's a reason for that. We'll go into it later when we get into more of, what was actually going on and how political it was and the actual, political situation back then. Jairus is a euphemism for Antipas. And it relates to a territorial area that was controlled by Antipas. And so they used the name Yaris based on the Hoveth Yar, which was the name of that territory. By the time Matthew wrote his gospel, Antipas had already been removed from power. So that connection was no longer a valid connection to his audience, to the readers. So the first two, Mark and Luke, have that name Yaris, representing Antipas. By the time Matthew gets around to writing his, Antipas is out of power, and so he doesn't need to put that name in there. And to have that connection to an actual political person. So, what are the Gospels? Most scholars don't know. They don't claim to know. They say, well, it's not really history. It's not really biography. It's, kind of mythic. Maybe it's entertainment. Some of it is based in history. Some of it, is pure fiction. You have to understand that at the time that the synoptics were written, especially, Rome occupied that whole Mediterranean area. So that anything of a political nature that the Jews in that area might have written would have been couched in probably allegorical tombs. They weren't going to... Basically, they lived in a theocracy, even though there were kings and even though there were Roman rulers and what have you. The common people still followed, the temple laws, and it was basically a theocracy run by, the Jerusalem temple. So there's no way that anybody could write anything of a political nature in that time and place without couching it in hidden terms. And that's what we see in the Gospels, that they are written, they're based on historical accounts, but they are written to shield their true intent and the lives of the people that are written about. What they are, when you delve into it and start analyzing some of the parables and some of the other stories, they're political propaganda. And as such, they can incorporate everything that the scholars have said. They can be partly historical, they can be partly biographical, they can be partly mythic, they can be partly fictional. Basically, what they're doing is they're writing about this man called Jesus and what he was trying to do, what he was trying to accomplish. And as some scholars have indicated, and I concur, he was a rebel. He was trying to overthrow two things. He was trying to overthrow the Roman occupation and the temple priesthood. Even though he was a priest, he was on the side of the common man, and as such, even though he was in a position of authority and wealth, as was his father, he was quite prepared to give that up in order to do the right thing by the people, and more importantly, to restore the Davidic kingdom with the covenant to God as part of defeating the Romans. In other words, it was essential for Jesus as a military and a political leader to get God on their side in any kind of a revolt against the Roman occupiers. With that in mind, in looking at the Gospels and reading them, you have to know their context. You have to know that these are political propaganda. that they are trying to accomplish spreading the word of a revolt and what Jesus is planning in terms that won't be understood by outsiders. And Jesus makes this clear throughout the Gospels that people who listen and who get it understand what he's saying, and people outside of that circle won't understand what he's saying. That's important to his message, that he's setting the tone. He's saying these things that I'm saying are couched in allegorical terms so that I can spread my message. And there just were two ways that he could spread it. He could either travel around and talk to people, as he does, and another way is to have these things written up and sent out to people as the Gospels, which is also done, which means ultimately that the Gospels were written very early. They were either taken from, his own accounts, or they were written with his knowledge very early in his political mission. And that's basically just a result of being propaganda. Propaganda is only effective early on when the person that they're talking about is alive, or when his movement is still active. Afterwards, the political propaganda ceases to be effective because there's no leader there, there's no movement there, so they wind up being changed a little bit to incorporate different ideas. And that's exactly what you see with the Gospels. Over the centuries, they have been added to and altered and changed. But there is enough essential stuff in there that we can pick it apart and understand what the goal was. The fact that Jesus was a person in history, that he was a political person, that he came from a wealthy and important family of the time and place, that he was a priest, and that he ultimately survived his crucifixion. The other thing that we need to look at is, okay, let's take it for granted that they're political propaganda. Who wrote the Gospels? And although there's no proof, there's no signature, there's no way of determining this exactly, my own research seems to indicate that Philo of Alexandria wrote at least the first two, Mark and Luke, possibly Matthew, but that's less certain. The first two are pretty certain because of basically one thing, and this comes from the Stanford University School of Philosophy that did an article on Philo, and that is that he was the only ancient writer who wrote basically Jewish works in Greek with Latin titles. And if you look at the first two, Mark and Luke, those are both Latin titles. Mark from Marcus and Luke from Lucifer, both Latin titles. Now, there are some scholars who will say, well, those names were attached to these Gospels later on, 100 or 200 years after, they were written. They don't know that. They can't prove that. People didn't just pull names out of a hat and say, oh, that sounds like a good name for this particular gospel. Let's give it that name. Or we'll associate it with, this person or that person, even though they probably didn't write it. No, there was a tradition from the first that those were the titles of the Gospels. And since Philo is the only ancient writer that wrote that way, that's a fingerprint. That's a stamp on those Gospels that says they're Jewish writings written in Greek with Latin titles. There are other things involved with determining that. Philo was a great one for writing allegorically. Many of his works, I don't know if it's a majority, but certainly many of his works were written allegorically. There are instances within some of those works where he is writing very similar to what is found in the Gospels. I know of one case where he uses the same phrase. He was about 30 when he began his ministry. That is also in Philo. Although he downplayed his political motivations in many of his works, he certainly had an attitude towards Rome and the Roman occupation. And he was nearly, he actually was a contemporary to Jesus and Jesus' father. And he was also a temple priest. So he would have had the possibility of knowing Jesus and Jesus' father Joseph firsthand. He made at least one trip to the Jerusalem temple. And as I'll show later, since we know that both Jesus and his father were temple priests, there's every likelihood that Philo would have known them. I don't know if you can find a better reason for discounting Philo as the writer than having a fingerprint as an ancient writer, then, let me know, because I'd be interested to hear that. As far as Matthew is concerned, that's a little more problematic because Matthew is a Hebrew name, basically. And while Philo still may have written Matthew, it just doesn't carry the same kind of guarantee that a fingerprint would, had it been a Latin title. And as for John, John is later. There are still things that can be taken from John that are important as far as the historical Jesus is concerned, but it's a more theological approach to his life. And although I study it, I don't use it quite so much as the synoptics. The synoptics for me are kind of the gold label for studying Jesus, and actually so is Josephus. Anyway, a scholar once said that historians don't really study history, they study other historians, and to a large degree that's true. The things that we can look at from the past, especially ancient history, come from historians. And so it's very easy to fall into the trap of kind of repeating the same views, sometimes the same mistakes and errors that previous historians have made in looking for the historical Jesus. I'm trying to look at things a little bit differently, and while I respect other scholars and their knowledge a great deal, I also see where they have either misinterpreted or altered some of the historical records to suit their approach or their view of the historical Jesus. So I've tried to do away with that. I've tried to look at things simply. I've tried to see how they were actually written, and I've tried to delve into the allegorical accounts within the Gospels to pull some history from them, some actual historical events that were written down allegorically to present to Jesus's audience and those who understood the allegory to pass along to their immediate friends and neighbors and what have you, and say, that's a nice story, but this is what he really means. This is what's going on. And I think that's key. You don't see that with a lot of the historians. They do not delve into the parables probably as much as they should, and they certainly don't look for any correlation between certain historical events and, you know, the parables that are in the Gospels. And there are some. And that pins it down. That pins down when these things were taking place and why these parables were written when they were written early on as political propaganda to spread the word. I will generally use scholars, the word scholars, to denote almost anybody that has spent some time researching the historical Jesus. And that means, you know, Christian apologists or historians or mythicists or even amateurs, many of whom know way more than I do. They're familiar with languages that, you know, like Greek, that I have to really study hard and pull apart to get to the point of, you know, what was being said. And they have much better recall on all of what was going on during Jesus's life. Like I say, the difference is I look at things a little bit differently, and I'm prepared to look at things outside of tradition. I think tradition really, really has influenced our view of the historical Jesus. And it's unfortunate because it's taken away an understanding of a man who was truly motivated, courageous, willing to risk death to achieve his goals. When you get to know who he is really historically, he's a pretty cool guy. He's somebody I would have looked up to for sure. Anyway, the next few sessions on this, we'll probably start with his birth narrative. And I'm not very organized, so I may skip around, and as things occur to me that I've come across that I want to share with you, I may inject them into a particular segment. So you kind of have to bear with me on that. But I'll try to do kind of a chronological approach. We'll look at his birth, and then we'll maybe go to the miracles. Then we'll go on to political stance, and then we'll finally finish up with the crucifixion, which is really interesting. I mean, really interesting. Just as a teaser, the Jews of his time saw him as a magician, as a sorcerer, and they were spot on. He knew some magic tricks that really aided his efforts to do what he wanted to do politically. So we'll go into all that. You'll see it all laid out for you, and should be within a short period of time that I get around to episode 2. Hopefully you'll come back for it and you get something out of all this, and we'll do it together. Thanks.